Condoleezza Rice is the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to Governor George W. Bush. She's also a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She combines academic and policy skills that make her a prime candidate for National Security Advisor or Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense should Governor Bush win the presidency this November. She was born in Alabama. She grew up during the violent years of the integration movement. Though originally determined to become a concert pianist, she turned to academia, becoming a professor and eventually provost at Stanford. As a member of the National Security Council in President Bush's administration, she helped craft the strategy that brought the Cold War to an end. She has been compared to both Henry Kissinger and Colin Powell. I spoke with her last night at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she was visiting. Here is that interview. If George W. Bush was president, what might he be doing now with respect to the Middle East?
Well, I suspect that any president of the United States would be doing much the same thing, and that's first trying to get an end to the violence. Obviously, nothing can happen until there's an end to the violence. And indeed, things looked as if they were going a little bit better for a couple of days, and then the events of today have certainly made it somewhat more difficult. And the apparent attack on an American destroyer, of course, complicates the situation even worse. Clearly, what has to be done is that the parties have to decide to end the violence so that they can get about the business of making peace. And probably at this point, the moderate Arab states are as important as any other actors in trying to calm the waters. So I suspect there are a lot of phone calls in Washington these days, a lot of efforts to draw on longtime allies, perhaps even the Europeans, to try to put some, I wouldn't call it pressure, to try to influence the parties to stop the violence.
What leverage do we have to bring certainly parties that have the ear of Yasser Arafat to do the best that he can to cease the violence?
Again, I think the moderate Arab states may be the key here, Egypt, Jordan. Clearly, Arafat probably has the ability to get some of these people out of the streets. I can't say that he can get everyone out of the streets, but Barack had made quite a lot of progress. He tried very hard, putting a lot on the table, and it would really be a pity if this violence now made it impossible for them to deliver on the opportunities that were presented over the last several months. So the leverage really is just an incentive to try and get the problem solved. And the Arab states, the moderate Arab states, may be the best deliverers of that message.
What would you have recommended to a President Bush to do if the opportunity had come to veto the Security Council resolution?
Governor Bush has been very clear that he's not going to judge the tactical decisions that the administration is making. It was clearly a one-sided resolution, there's no doubt about that, and UN resolutions are UN resolutions. But the administration made the decision within the context of a very difficult decision, and Governor Bush has said he's not going to second-guess that one way or another.
There's also much discussion about the U.S. role. I mean, how do you balance being a friend of Israel, a democracy and a long-standing friend, the only democracy in the Middle East, and the role of an honest broker? This president has invested lots of time in trying to befriend Yasser Arafat, who is clearly the crucial figure who rejected an effort by the Prime Minister to go further than any other Prime Minister of Israel had ever been.
Well, there are several things at play. First of all, we have to recognize that the circumstances that created the opening for direct Palestinian-Israeli dialogue really goes back to a significant change in the circumstances in the Middle East coming out of the Persian Gulf War and coming out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, first with Madrid and then Oslo and so on and so on. So America's role in the region as a whole and America's credibility in the region as a whole does have an influence on what we're able to do in the peace process. But every American president since President Carter has felt that he wanted to put one piece of the puzzle in place in the peace process. It's been bipartisan, it's been a long-term effort. There can't be any artificial deadlines. These are very, very difficult issues. They may take a while to resolve. But the United States has to remember a couple of things. We have a valuable ally, but not just ally, but friend in Israel, and you stand by your friends. And Israel is taking some significant risk for peace here. Even when Israel doesn't take risk for peace, Israel is our friend. But Israel is taking risk for peace. Barack has gone very, very far. Israel deserves our support. We do also have very good offices with a number of moderate Arab states. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are states that might not have been in existence had it not been for the United States. We have long-standing relations with Jordan and Egypt. So I think we do have, on both sides of the ledger, very good leverage, very good friends, but we have to remember that the relationship with Israel is special.
Is it your best judgment that those states missed an opportunity to encourage Arafat to pursue peace when he left Camp David and made his tour of those countries?
It appears that they may have missed that opportunity. Clearly, Arafat got the message that any unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state outside of the peace process would be a mistake, and that was a helpful message. And that message apparently came not only from moderate Arab states, but from Europeans that might have supported him. That was helpful. But obviously, with so much at stake, you would have hoped that there might have been more support for the Palestinians to take the deal.
Let me turn to Yugoslavia. What's the significance of what's happened there, and how is it, in your judgment, connected to the rightness or the wrongness of the war against Kosovo?
The near-term enabling condition was the war against Milosevic in Kosovo, which clearly put him in a position of international isolation. If you ask me, he should have been in a position of international isolation much earlier. I'm not certain that dealing with him as we did at Dayton didn't prolong his life in Serbia. But
Wait, we should not have brought him into Dayton?
I think that hindsight is 20/20, but clearly we made something of a statesman of him at Dayton, and he was being defeated by the Croatians and the Bosnians. He took the deal.
But would Dayton have been possible without his presence and the role he played?
Probably not, but the byproduct of that was that I think he got a longer life in Serbia than he might otherwise have had. But clearly the short-term or the near-term proximate cause was what happened in Kosovo. And we did the right thing. We did the right thing to stop him from running through the province. We did the right thing to use NATO as an instrument to stop what would clearly have been a destabilizing factor in a region. We forget that when we moved NATO east, we moved pretty close to the Balkans. And so the Balkans were now in NATO's backyard, Hungary's backyard to be specific, and so we did the right thing. Now, the longer term, however, really has to go all the way back to 1989 and to the revolution that Solidarity began. This is a tremendous wave of freedom that is sweeping all of Europe, and the incentives in Europe to join the community of free nations are very, very powerful. It isn't as if there isn't a better world out there than Slobodan Milosevic was able to offer his people in Serbia. So this is a large sweep of history, and we have to keep that in mind as well.
Do you think that what's happened in the last week or two to Slobodan Milosevic and coming on the heels of the war, what implications is that for another action like that by NATO?
Well, NATO's area, if you want to talk of the Balkans, hopefully there won't be need for any further action of that kind. We can hope that Milosevic is the last of the European dictators, Tudjman having died. Milosevic would seem to be the last great threat in that region. We would want to be. We would want to take that kind of military action. I think we would want to be very, very careful in transporting or in making analogous what we might do in some other part of the world to what we were able to do in NATO. First of all, because we have a long-standing infrastructure in Europe, the NATO alliance, a set of security commitments there that are quite clear, and because you have the pull of a larger Europe, whether it's the European Union membership or anything else, Europe is different than some of the other places that we might enter civil conflicts. You know, we have to be warned, the last time we took a European strategy and tried to export it was when we took containment and thought that it worked in a place called Vietnam. So we have to be very careful in taking strategies that are born of specific circumstances in Europe and assuming that those same strategies would work elsewhere in the world.
That takes me to the debate and bigger questions of foreign policy. You advised the Texas governor as to this debate, and were said to be maybe the person who shaped his preparation more than anyone else. How do you measure how well he did last night?
I think he did very well last night because he was able to get across to the American people what those of us who've been working with him have known all along, which is that he understands these issues in depth, that he had something he wanted to say to the American people. I remarked myself at how conversational he was with the American people about these very, very difficult issues. He was able to communicate principles from which he would lead, and he was able to draw some very important distinctions. It's not easy to sit there and say, I think there have to be limits on how the American president uses the American military in a time when the United States seems to have unlimited power.
But I didn't understand where he would draw the limits other than in the national interest, which gives a broad leverage to him.
Well, but I think he made very clear that he thought that militaries are essentially for the purposes of deterring, fighting, and winning wars, not for the purposes of civil administration and nation building and long-term peacekeeping. And that's controversial. There's no doubt that it's controversial. But if you ask yourself, should the United States tie down its military in a number of civil conflicts around the world, you may get a different answer than if you ask, should we go into a civil conflict?
When he said we ought to be humble, what did he mean and what was he referring to?
Ever since I first talked to Governor Bush about foreign policy, this has been something that has been on his mind. He feels very strongly that a country that wields as much power and influence as the United States could easily be perceived as arrogant in the world, that it could be perceived as we know best about everything, that we could be perceived as uninterested in what others think about their own future, rather with our kind of American can-do attitude, fixing it for everybody else. And from the very beginning, and in fact, it's kind of interesting, it got written out somehow of his speech at the Reagan Library, but there was quite a long section on the need to be humble with power. So maybe it got written out in the Reagan Library speech. He brought it back in the debates. I'm very glad he did. It's an important point.
Do you think most Americans care about foreign policy when American lives are not at risk?
Americans care about foreign policy. When I go out and talk to groups, whether it's a Rotary Club or a Boys and Girls Club, Americans care about some issues. They care about trade. They understand instinctively, particularly in places like California, where I live, where you have export-driven economies, that free trade is important to the American economy. They care about the state of the military. Almost everybody has somebody who's either served in the military or is serving in the military or serves in the National Guard, and they've heard the stories about problems with morale and readiness. They're interested in those issues. But no, foreign policy, I'm an expert in foreign policy. I'd love it to be number 1, 2, and 3 in the American psyche. But obviously, there are also other issues on Americans' minds, but they're not uninterested. And foreign policy is a kind of surrogate for Americans, I think, for leadership, for trust in their president. Every American thinks of their president on the day when he has to go into the Oval Office and say, my fellow Americans, I have to do something hard.
But it's confidence that they can handle the job if there is a crisis.
Right. That's right. They want to be sure that on that moment they can handle the job.
Tell me what you felt like you had to do in terms of working with the governor, in terms of training him to communicate that particular point, that he was up to the job. Because some have said that the debates were, when you shaved it down to the essence, it was about character versus competency. There were some questions about...
Well, I might argue with that characterization. I think it was about trust. Obviously, the American people want to be sure that the President of the United States is someone that they can trust, someone that they want to have in their living room every night. And as I said, someone that they can trust on that most important day when you have to do something hard. But Governor Bush came to this business with very strong principles about foreign policy. From the first time we talked, he talked about American military power and the importance of keeping it strong. He talked about friends and allies. And he was very influenced by something that George Shultz said, which is that you have to garden in your alliances. That means you have to keep them up so that when you need your friends, you've called them before you have to call on them. He talked early on about the importance of putting Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, back on the agenda which it had dropped off the agenda in American foreign policy. So he came with very strong views about what to do in foreign policy. Our job...
Came to the first meeting with you, or came to this campaign?
Came to the very first time that we talked about it, which was actually a little bit before he decided to run for president. This goes back to August of 1998.
At Kennebunkport?
At Kennebunkport, that's right. So he had very strong convictions about what he wanted to do. Our job was simply to take the various issues out there and to walk through them with him, to work through them, to look at options for carrying out the agenda that he wanted to establish. And what he needed to communicate, and I think what he communicated very well last night, was that he does lead from principle, but that he also understands how to make a decision. You know, I think some of this talk about what people do and do not know about foreign policy misunderstands what the President of the United States actually does in foreign policy. The President of the United States does not sit around debating with his special assistants the ins and outs of the Russian electoral system. That's a waste of the President's time. What the President must do is what any other chief executive does, which is to set an agenda, to develop options, to have people develop options, to make judgments, to convince the American people, and perhaps most importantly, to work across the aisle to convince both sides of Congress, the bipartisan consensus.
But people will constantly raise this point about being president, and we know this because of what we know about the deliberations at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and President Kennedy. You have advisors advising different things. You can't just say, I'm okay in this because I got Condoleezza Rice in the room, or Colin Powell, or George Shultz. You have to know and have the capacity to make judgments about conflicting advice.
Absolutely.
How do we know he has that ability?
Because he's been a chief executive. He's had to do it. He's been in a job where the buck stops there in Texas, where he had to make decisions among competing advice. Now, decision-making in foreign policy is actually not that different than decision-making in anything else. People will give you different options.
Stakes may be high.
The stakes may or may not be higher depending on the decision that you're taking. But the fact is that people will give you different options. Any advisor will tell you gladly why they're right. If you're smart as a chief executive, you'll ask them, why might you be wrong? And what Governor Bush is very good at doing is probing and pressing and pushing his advisors to the logical implications of what they are suggesting. I've often thought that if President Clinton had asked Secretary Albright, when she said that Milosevic would cave in 3 days, why might you be wrong? We might have thought that differently. So yes, people who are chief executives know how to deal with competing advice. It's what they do.
You are not running against President Clinton in this election. You're running against Al Gore, a vice president. What is, in your judgment, coming out of the debate last night in terms of the use of force? The governor seemed to be more reluctant to use American force than the vice president. The vice president seemed to be more of an interventionist. Do you accept that as a difference?
I had some trouble following precisely what the vice president was saying about intervention. Let me separate two issues. One is, when do you use force? And it seemed to me that you got from both of them fairly standard criteria, and also the notion that you do have to look at the circumstances. But for what purposes do you use force? I thought you got quite different answers. Or for what purposes do you use the military? Not really do you use force. I was interested that Vice President Gore talked about the Marshall Plan in the regards to the use of force. The Marshall Plan was not about the use of force. First of all, let's be realistic. The United States was occupying Germany under terms of unconditional surrender. It was occupying Japan under terms of unconditional surrender. And what the United States did with that period of time was to help reinvigorate local institutions with massive economic assistance at a time when those economies were flat on their back. But it was the economic assistance, and then the private capital and non-governmental institutions and Marshall scholarships and Fulbright scholarships that reinvigorated those societies. So the question isn't, should the United States be involved in helping others build democracy? It's, what's the right instrument for that? And if you focus on the military as somehow a nation builder or the carrier of democracy, you forget that non-governmental institutions are sometimes much more effective, that economic assistance, that trade, that faith-based institutions, universities are really, in many ways, America's strongest instruments.
Tell me what countries he might be willing to retire the debt or to excuse the debt.
I don't think Governor Bush is yet in a position or ready to name countries. But
clearly it's a principle that he wants to consider.
It's a principle that he wants to consider, and I thought he laid out some of the criteria last night that he would consider. And I was very glad that he brought up helping with debt relief, because there are a number now of developing countries where we have emerging democracies, where these populations have suffered under miserable governments for most of their histories, miserable governments where people have stolen the country blind and run up huge debts, where you have cases of potentially good leaders who are not corrupt, who are prepared to make difficult economic reforms and changes at home. I think you ought to be willing to consider a change in the debt structure, and we've done it before. You know, the Brady bonds were a kind of debt relief and debt restructuring for Latin America. And when I hear people talk about the hopelessness of Africa, for instance, I think back to, say, 1987 or 1988 in Latin America, where you had a lot of countries heavily burdened with debt, where you had countries that were just coming out of military rule, military juntas for the most part, where you had civil wars in Central America. And with a fairly sophisticated plan, some 12, 13 years later, there are a lot of success stories in Latin America. So it can be done.
The United Nations, where is the governor in terms of American debt to the United Nations and his sense of the role of the United Nations in peacekeeping and
Well, the governor believes the United Nations has an important role to play, potentially even in peacekeeping, but I think that he's somewhat skeptical of the idea that the United Nations could become a major force, and I mean military force for peacekeeping. You need somehow the discipline of nations, of states to do that, and I think he's rather more attracted to the idea of regional powers that may be willing to do peacekeeping in their own regions. And he cites very often, as he did the other night, I think Australia.
with participation of American troops?
With the help of American training, for instance, infrastructure, communications, but not American troops.
Even if it's regional, if it's NATO, for example?
Well, NATO is somewhat different because of our Article 5 commitments to NATO. That's the difference there.
Okay, second question, last question. Next one, human rights. The Vice President mentioned human rights last night. The governor did.
Yes, but the governor talked about freedom, and I think that freedom and human rights tend to go together.
But it was different in terms of code words or something you suggested?
No, I just think it's a different word for human rights. Freedom is the bedrock, that's the foundation of any notion of human rights. The governor's been very clear that he believes that human rights, religious freedom, all of these things should be on the agenda when you talk to any leader. But that in some circumstances, you're going to get further. Let's take a country like China. As China liberalizes its economy, its politics is going to liberalize. And the Chinese are perhaps betting that that's not going to happen. But I think they're taking a bad bet. If they're taking that bet, they're taking a bet that the Taiwanese, the South Koreans, the Chileans all took and missed. So sometimes you have to work from several different angles to get human rights, but the governor believes that human rights and democracy are extremely important. It reflects America's values.
Let's assume that your dreams are answered and George W. Bush is elected president. And he says to you, I want you to come to Washington with me. And he says to you, there's always Secretary of Defense. You're interested in military issues. There is always Secretary of State. You're interested in diplomatic issues. And there's always National Security Advisor, and you know how important it is for the president to have someone that he's worked with, that he trusts next to him. What would you say?
Can we win the election before we staff the administration? I've said it 1,000 times, Charlie. If National Football League Commissioner comes up first, I'm gone.
Is that right?
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah. I don't think Tagliabue is not about.
I don't know. You know, he's been there a long time. I'm waiting.
My thanks to Condoleezza Rice, also the people at the Council on Foreign Relations, for the conversation that took place last night. Coming up next, we'll turn to baseball and Tim McCarver.